mythological and philosophical background of the Bhagavad Gita.
And in each verse there are some interesting points about the two cultures that were intermingling in prehistory. We are talking of the prehistorical times. And at the time of the Gita's composition, we are seeing these two cultures and the values that these two cultures represented. They have to be integrated. And that integration is being done very beautifully by Vyasa. This is a fact that there was a pre-Aryan civilization. And the pre-Aryan civilization had certain customs and traditions. One of them was this Pitrayani, the way of the Pitrus, belief in the ancestors, and belief that after a person dies, he goes to the Pitrayana. And the rituals that people do on earth when they are living, that supports their ancestors in the heavens. This was a pre-Aryan way of thinking, ancestral way of thinking. And when the Aryans came in, they brought in this Devayana, the way of the gods. They thought of a heaven where people will go when they do meritorious deeds, they go to heaven. And the pre-Aryans believed in polyandry. As we can see, Draupadi married 5 husbands. This was a pre-Aryan way of life. And so, according to Nataraja Guru, Pandavas belonged to the pre-Aryan context. They were dark-skinned pre-Aryans. He insists on calling them as pre-Aryans. At the same time, they are conceived from the gods. So that shows how the Aryan values are integrated into their culture. Because Kunti got these children from the Devatas. Indra brought Arjuna, and from Dharmaraja, Yudhishthira came. So from a sociological point of view or a historical point of view, it's important to remember it has nothing to do with the religious purity and later caste distinctions that came much later. But the prehistory of India was the amorphous and intermingling and the coming together of two traditions, which is the pre-Aryan tradition of the Pitrayana and the Devayana tradition of the Aryans. Now what is happening here through Sri Krishna is that these are called relativistic tendencies. They are relativistic because they don't speak of absolute values. They all speak of something which is temporary or passing, or values which cannot be sustained. So in the form of Sri Krishna, there is a complete revaluation of these relativistic values, and a new dharma is introduced, which is of an absolute, universal character. Now, I was just thinking of an example that we have in our modern day world. Today is Diana, Princess of Wales, I think 1 year anniversary. Now, if you see the Queen and the King and Prince Charles, they represent an old traditional way of thinking of their clan. And then you see a princess who represents a universal value. She transforms the monarchy because she has an appeal which reaches out to the whole world. The whole world feels one with her. That's a universal value. So she has a spiritual quality actually, which can touch the hearts of people all over the world. And suddenly the monarchy is no longer the same. The monarchy has to change. The monarchy is the old traditional value, but something new and fresh and much more relevant to our times comes in, and that changes the monarchy. The queen herself has to bow down. All the old traditions have to change. Now when you see characters like Bhishma and Drona, they represent the old static type of traditions, which were patriarchal, which was basically old-fashioned. And when you see an Arjuna, he is the representative of a new and a fresh and an intelligent person who brings about universal values. So Gita can be a book of universal values. So when Gita is interpreted correctly, it stands for all intelligent people all over the world who stand for righteousness. It need not be confined to one's community or confined to one's clan or tribe or any such thing. But in the first chapter, Arjuna is facing just these challenges. He is worried about his community. He is worried about his tribe. He is worried about his ancestors. So the feelings that he gets are not true spiritual feelings. They are still in the relativistic plane. They are still to do with relativity. Now, in the Upanishadic Dharma, we are always talking of the absolute. We spoke of the Vedic Dharma and we spoke of the Upanishadic Dharma. In the Vedic Dharma, it is relativistic because we have what is known as the gods there, and then we have certain desires, and we are appeasing the gods for our desires, etc. This is in general. Whereas in Upanishadic Dharma, we are speaking of the very self, which is the self of all, the self that pervades everything, the self that is transcendental, the self that is not conditioned by time or clime. So that is called an absolute. It's an absolutist way of life, in which a person is uncompromising with his bipolarity with the Supreme. It's an uncompromising attitude of absolutism. And that is what Sri Krishna represents, the absolute. Even when we say the absolute Godhead or the absolute One, there is no other. There is only one Supreme. And I relate with that one Supreme. That is absolutism. But if I think there are so many different beings, and I try to relate with all of them, that is considered as relativism. So in relativism there are grades. That means one is good and one is not good, or one is high and one is low. In absolutism you are seeing only one Supreme, and everything is a manifestation of that Supreme. If you can get that vision, then you are an absolutist. And it is that absolutism to which the correction is taking place. So this is our background, and with this background, as we said before, we have to move between the story, the narrative of the Mahabharata, and the actual symbolism that is represented. If you look at the modern history, a historian says, all I am doing is I am interpreting the facts. What is history? It's only an interpretation of fact. So a Marxist version of history will be different from Toynbee's version of history. According to Karl Marx, everything is a product of the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeois. So he says history has evolved from this conflict between people who have the power and people who don't have the power. So that's his vision of history. If you read somebody like Arthur Toynbee, he says history is blast and counterblast. There is an event happening from one quarter of the world, and there is a reaction to it, the counterblast. So blast and counterblast, he says these are the two factors. The interaction of these two factors creates human history. When we come to a work like Mahabharata, you see history here is not treated as just an academic subject, but history has been converted into something which can also relate to man's inner state. So one way we say it's mythology, but in that mythology there is a symbolism. And actual historical events have a psychological and a spiritual dimension also. So they're not just facts to be studied, but they have so cleverly put those facts as our own mental makeup, our psychology, and our own spirituality. So history, psychology, and spirituality, they become interlaced. And that is how we have this kind of scheme. If you read the Mahabharata, or if you read the first chapter, what is happening is we are getting an idea of history, but we are also getting a description of our inner self, and we are also getting a gradation of values. What is a spiritual value? What is relativistic values? What are higher spiritual values? And what are ordinary spiritual values? For instance, in the case of Duryodhana, Duryodhana's values are relativistic. How high can he go? He can go only as high as the earthly values of kingship. That's his limit. When you see Arjuna before he becomes a disciple of Sri Krishna, he's little higher than Duryodhana. His values go up to concern for his family, his community, his tribe, his clan. But he doesn't think of the whole of the world. He's just thinking of the problems that his community will face, the destruction that will come to his people. So he's better than Drona, but he still hasn't reached the true vision of a Mahatma. When you become a Mahatma like Vivekananda or Aurobindo, their vision reaches out to the whole world. So they transcend their limitation of nationality or their connections with just a small group. They start relating with the whole of the world, and that is the highest spirituality. Sri Krishna represents that spirituality, where he is called the Jagat Guru. He has come as the teacher of the whole world. And when Arjuna becomes a disciple of Sri Krishna in the second chapter, that this absolutist correction is taking place. This dharma, which is called the Manava Dharma, is being taught to him, the absolutist dharma. Dharma, as we said, is what makes a thing what it is. So, the dharma of fire is to heat. Dharma of fire is to give light. Dharma of ice is to cool. So that what makes a thing behave in a particular way, that is its dharma. So what is the dharma of a human being? What is a human being supposed to do, or how is a human being supposed to live? That is a human being's dharma, one's own dharma, swadharma. Knowing one's own dharma is one of the important contributions of the Gita. Each person must discover what is that person's dharma, how is that person supposed to function in the most efficient and harmonious way. You can say that is also the yoga. So once Arjuna is on the battlefield, he is taken to the middle of the battlefield. As we said last week, that itself shows the coming to the center of a dialectical situation. Dialectics means taking two counterparts. Everything in life is dialectical. There are always two counterparts in a situation. And he is coming to the neutral center. He doesn't want to just see his enemy, but he wants to see both the counterparts in that situation. And that itself is a symbolism, because the fight has actually started. And after the war has started, or the arrows have started flying, he asks to be taken to the middle of the battlefield. But here again, there is a point to be noted, that he is not shown both the sides, but he is shown only the Kaurava side. And in the Kaurava side, he is shown specifically Bhishma and Drona. Now Bhishma is the Pitamaha, he is the ancestor. And as we just said, he represents that Pitrayana Marg, that culture in which the ancestors were worshipped. An ancient way of life in which ancestor worship was prevailing. And Drona represents the Devayana, the way of life in which the Devas or the gods were worshipped. And these two symbols are there before Arjuna. And the moment he sees these two, his patriarch and his teacher, he undergoes a complete transformation. He cannot then see them as enemies anymore. So it affects him deeply. Does it affect him psychologically? It's a kind of a mystical affection in which his function as a warrior becomes completely disoriented. Now there is an argument, did he become a coward? No, he is not at all a coward, because he has been through so many wars. He is a veteran of warfare. Yet at this particular time he begins to falter. And this philosophy of his, or that spirituality of his, starts surfacing. And he says that I cannot kill these people who are my friends, who are my relatives, who are my teachers, and who are my ancestors. So having said that, he starts now philosophizing. And on close scrutiny, the whole of the philosophy of the first chapter, coming from the mouth of Arjuna, is the same relativistic philosophy. It is a philosophy which is noble. It's definitely indication of a noble mind, that Arjuna has a noble mind. But he still hasn't got the kind of true spiritual qualities which will come only in the next chapter. Interestingly also, Krishna does not teach him anything in the first chapter. Even though they are friends, he calls him Achyuta. Achyuta means one who is firm, unmoving, established. That is indication of the spirit, that which never changes. So Achyuta is Sri Krishna, and Partha, or the son of Prithi, is Arjuna. And before coming to this position, we had the description of the Kaurava side, which showed their general disarray, their relativism, and lack of any order. It is a horizontal kind of situation in which Duryodhana himself is diffident. He lacks confidence. His values go up only to the world. Their head is only Bhishma, who himself is a feeble old man. And when he blows the conch, there is a confused clang. On the other side is the Pandava army, Krishna with them, and Arjuna. First of all, Krishna blows his conch. Panchajanyam Hrishikesham Devadattam Dhananjaya. So, just to give an indication of the order and the hierarchy of values in the Pandava army, we can see how the conches are blown and the symbol of each conch. So, Panchajanyam Hrishikesha, that is Krishna blowing the Panchajanyam. There is a story behind Panchajanya. Panchajanya comes from the sea. It means also the 5 elements of Sankhya. The world is composed of 5 elements, that is earth, water, fire, air and akasha, ether. So Panchajanyam can mean the 5 values of Sankhya. It can also mean the 5 types of communities, like we have the Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra and the Nishadas, or the people who are not even in the caste, the outcast. So Panchajanya can mean the 5 types of people. Or there is also a story in which when Krishna and Balrama were studying under their teacher, Sandipana, his son was kidnapped by an asura who lived inside a conch, and his name was Panchajaya. And so Krishna goes and he prays to Varuna, and they capture that asura and they take away his conch. So that conch, because it came from Panchajaya, became the Panchajanyam. The conch of Shri Krishna. And the conch of Arjuna is Devadattam, given by the gods. So again there is an indication of a Vedic link there, given by the gods, the Devas. And then we come to Bhima. Bhima is Poundram Dadmo Mahashankam. So Bhima represents a kind of a Hercules type of character. He represents humanity, human values. He is called Vrakodara. Udara means belly, Vrako means wolf. He had a terrific appetite, so Vrakodara. And his shank is called Poundram, which comes from the Pundara, which has a Shaivite link. And Ananta Vijayam Raja, this is Yudhishthira. Yudhishthira itself means one who is firm in battle. And one who is firm in battle will always be victorious. So his conch is called Ananta Vijayam, always victorious. The next conch is Nakula. Nakula is called Sughosha. Sughosha means that which sounds very nice. And Mani Pushpaka. Mani Pushpaka is Sahadeva. So Sahadeva's conch is called Mani Pushpaka. Mani means jewels and Pushpaka means flowers, that which is floral and full of jewels. So it is very beautiful to see. Aesthetic values. So first we have the divine values presented in Shri Krishna and Arjuna. They are bracketed together, as it were. They are 2 counterparts of the wisdom situation. And then we have next the human type of person represented by Bhima. And only then we see the virtuous character of Yudhishthira. And finally we come to the aesthetic qualities of luxury. So even in the value system in spirituality, the highest value is given to the bipolarity between the guru and the disciple, or the devotee and the Lord. And then we come to human values. And only then we come to virtue and luxurious values, which come further down. This orderliness that is shown in the Pandava army, that itself indicates that there is a hierarchy of values. Values are placed in an orderly fashion and not a confused clang as in the case of the Kauravas. So if you look like that minutely, you can see that there are a lot of little symbols. Now we haven't even come to the real teachings of the Gita as yet. The real teachings of the Gita come only in the 2nd chapter after the 11th verse. Till then, these are the backgrounds, and very often many commentators don't pay attention to the 1st chapter because there is no real teaching here. But by looking into this, we are getting a little hint into the background of the culture and the mind of the composer. When Vyasa composed this poem, the kind of scheme that he had in his mind and how he was arranging all the values so that a discerning reader can see how to distinguish between the values which are belonging to the divine and values which belong to the relativistic world, and how a correction is to be brought about. Now these questions of Arjuna will be answered in the course of the Gita. In different chapters there are verses which will specifically answer all the questions that Arjuna raises. As we said, they are concerned with only relativity, and they are concerned with destruction of the Pitraloka. He is afraid that the Pitraloka will be destroyed, and he is afraid of the Varna Sankara, that is the destruction of the clan. Now Varna Sankara here, according to Nataraja Guru, has nothing to do with the caste system, because he is still talking in terms of a racial and a tribal way of thinking. And it's an open book, so the Gita does not distinguish or categorize people according to their varna. On the contrary, it says anybody who is interested or anybody who feels the urge can study the Gita. And the road to wisdom is always an open road. It's a public road. not an esoteric road or an exclusive road. So Bhishma, he is like a Moses of the chosen people, and Krishna represents a Christ of the whole world, one who can appeal to all people of the world. So that's another evaluation, going from a close group to a teacher who can appeal to all people. So this is just the few points here about the beginning, the first chapter. And it is called a Vishada. So this Vishada or despondency of Arjuna is the beginning of his enlightenment. In this particular way of thinking, the disciple or the seeker characteristically comes to a conflict or comes to a paradox, and therefore needs the guidance of a wise teacher, wise master, a wisdom teacher, to help him to get out of this contradiction. In the Yoga Vashishta Ramayana also, we have the case of Sri Rama coming to a similar kind of contradiction, and then he goes to Vashishta Muni, and Vashishta Muni teaches him about the nature of the world and the nature of his own self, and how a person through the ignorance or avidya and wrong conditioning begins to identify with something which is changing, and this changing identification is the root cause of a person's problems. So in Vedanta, the whole effort is to realize one's true nature, to realize that which is permanent in one, the constant behind all the variables. The world is a continuous flux of variety, and in that variety, if a person is able to discern or able to see the constant, that which is never changing, then the person becomes wise. The person becomes stabilized. Until that stage, the forces will always rock the mind or rock the intellect of a person and create its own moods of sometimes elevating the person, sometimes disappointing the person. So it is from that duality that a person is trying to find release. And the first step to release oneself is to come to the dialectical center, to place oneself in the center of situations so that one can have a clear look. That is the secret of yoga, is the ability to come to a dialectical center and to cancel out counterparts. And karmasu kaushalam, dexterity in action, and disaffiliation from the context of suffering. So these are some of the definitions of yoga that are given in the Gita. Now, killing, etc. here is in the context of the battlefield. He's saying, I don't want to kill my relatives. So he hasn't got the real ahimsa as yet. The real ahimsa of a saintly type, the Mahatma Gandhi type, he says, ahimsa, do not hurt anybody, do not hurt a living creature. So Arjuna hasn't got that kind of ahimsa as yet. He is only concerned about not killing my friends, not killing my relatives, not killing my elders and my teachers. So he also has that rudiments of relativism. Here we see all the characters are in different stages of relativism. Dhritarashtra says, Mamakaha Pandavas Kimachaiva Kimukurvata Sanjaya. Dhritarashtra himself, being the king, has got this partiality in his mind. And Duryodhana also represents another character who has the sense of duality. He is concerned about protecting Bhishma, who is the leader. And Arjuna too, though he has a superior kind of emotion, he is still not free of relativism. He is still within the relativistic way of thinking. And what will happen after Arjuna is properly disciplined by Sri Krishna is Arjuna begins to have the universal vision and the ability to see all people in a more unitive way. So this is the way I was more interested in the historic and the symbolic meanings here. So I went into the study of the symbolism and the historical background and tried to be as careful not to get prejudiced by any cultural feeling. In that process, I found that there is a whole revaluation going on here between one tradition or one way of life and a more advanced way of thinking coming into the consciousness of the people. So this will help to put certain deep-seated prejudice in the Indian mind. Almost every Indian mind has got these rudiments of this sort of thinking that has come in with our culture. And we don't realize it, but almost everybody instinctively reacts to a thought of Pitriyana or a thought of Devas or the thought of the ancestors. And everybody is almost superstitious. There is some level of superstition operating. And when the word wisdom casts its impartial light, then a person should begin to see where one's own thinking has been conditioned and how one's own mind can be clarified and a more clear vision is obtained. This is all we have to say here in the first chapter. So the divine consciousness, Krishna is representing the divine consciousness as the one, and then at the individual level we have a conditioned consciousness of Arjuna. So the question arises that Sri Krishna also had relatives and friends in the battlefield, and Arjuna also had friends and relatives on the battlefield. And why does Arjuna cry and Krishna smile? So because Arjuna was seeing only the here and now, whereas Krishna could see the past, the present and the future. And he could have a total vision, a complete picture. Whereas Arjuna's vision was only partial. He could only see the scene that was before him, and he reacted accordingly. He could not see the past causes which had precipitated that particular event, and neither could he see what the outcome was going to be. So that represents a normal person's mind, which is always conditioned by his surroundings and affected by it. But through the intuitive power that we have within us, when we awaken our own intuition, we are able to grasp and we are able to glimpse at the eternal, the all-pervading, or the higher self. And once we do that, we also begin to have a vision which can go beyond the here and now. So the whole process of yoga is the transformation that we are doing within ourselves. In the course of the Gita, we internalize the teachings from the outside to our own inner self. So the Mahabharata also becomes internalized as the conflict of values within a person. And Arjuna becomes internalized as the intelligence that is operating inside us, the alertness, the vigilance that we have within us. And Sri Krishna becomes internalized as the self, the light that is shining within us. Before we come to that, we are looking into the social and the various historical ideas that are presented here through the symbolism of the battlefield and the characters here. Again, we can say the Pitrayana way, which is the pre-Aryan ancient ways of ancestor worship, which existed in many cultures around the world, and then the Aryan correction, which was a little more superior way of the heavens, but also relativistic. And then finally the absolutist way, in which you are talking of the eternal. You want to go to the eternal, and you are going to a higher development where there is no relativity. And that is the absolutism to which we are gradually being taken through the teaching. When we came to the second chapter called Sankhya Yoga, Sankhya itself is one of the Shadadarshanas, 6 systems of philosophy. There are 6 philosophical systems which have been composed by 6 different rishis. So there was a Kapila Muni, and the Kapila Muni came up with the Sankhya Darshan. Then there was Patanjali. Patanjali came up with the Yoga Darshan. And then there was Gautama. He came up with the Nyaya. And then Kanada came up with the Vaisheshika. Jaimani came with the Purva Mimamsa, and Vyasa or Badrayana came with the Uttara Mimamsa or Vedanta. So in the Sankhya system we got the first principles about how the world came into being, how creation came into being. It's a Gnostic darshan, there is no God there. Kapila was a rationalist thinker. He did not want to give any creator. He said, let me explain how life has come into this planet, how did we all come into being. So he said first in the beginning there were just 2 forces. One was called Purusha and one was called Prakriti. Purusha was spirit and Prakriti is matter. And he said in the beginning they were so interlaced, you could not distinguish one from the other. And so he called it the avyakta state, the indiscernible state. And then some event took place, a stir took place as it were. And through that stir there was a separation. The Prakriti separated and the Purusha, the spirit principle separated and became pure intelligence, and the Prakriti principle separated and that started categorizing itself. First as a mind, it became an overmind, Mahat Tattva. Then it became an Ahankara. And from that gradually the 5 sense organs were created and 5 organs of action were created and the 3 gunas were created. And from that again further concretization, it became more gross and it became the 5 elements. So the 5 senses are related to the 5 elements. Smell comes from earth, taste comes from water, sight comes from fire, touch comes from air, and sound comes from ether. So 5 Panchabhutas and the 5 sense organs and the 5 senses and mind. So he categorized them like this, and they all work out to 24 categories. That is called Sankhya. So Sankhya was the first theory that explained the world, and some of its concepts were so good that they were accepted by all later philosophers. So the guna theory that we have, sattva, rajas and tamas, that comes from the Sankhya theory. And that the world is made up of 5 elements, this comes from the Sankhya theory. Now Patanjali, he was another rishi. When he came, he devised a system of self-discipline called the Ashtanga Yoga, in which in 8 steps a person can discipline himself to withdraw himself from the surface consciousness and to merge with one's own self. And he called that the Kaivalya state. After doing Ashtanga Yoga, you reach the state of Kaivalya. You discover your aloneness. So first you have to practice yamas and niyamas. And the yamas are 5 types: ahimsa, satyam, asteya, brahmacharya, parigraha. Ahimsa we all know. And 5 niyamas also. That is saucha, santosha, tapaswadhyaya, ishvara pranidhana. And once your yamas and niyamas are perfected, then you can come to asana, pratyahara, withdraw yourself. Then pranayama. Then once you have disciplined yourself with pranayama, controlling of your prana. Prana is the vital energy in us, and the prana in us is the seat on which our mind and our senses work. So there is a story in the Upanishads that the Indriyas, the 5 sense organs, and the mind, they had an argument to decide who was the most important of them. And so the eye said, I am the most important, and the eye departed for 1 year and came back and asked the rest of the organs. And the organs said, fine, we lived for 1 year, we did not see anything, but we adjusted. And it was actually quite nice, we were not distracted anymore by sight. So similarly all the 5 sense organs left, the ear left and the taste left and the hearing left. Finally the mind also left for 1 year, and when the mind came back, it asked the rest of the organs. They said, yes, we lived like an imbecile for about a year, but we could manage. Finally the prana decided to leave, but the moment the prana decided to leave, all the organs started shaking in their base. So if the prana leaves, then a human being cannot function. So this prana in us, which is experienced as our breathing, but which is more subtle than the breath, that is the seat. And when that prana is disciplined, it becomes a means for a person to attain his spiritual consciousness. So pranayama, dharana, dhyana and samadhi. Dharana. Dharana is when you can sustain one thought for a period of time, it is called dharana. And dhyana means meditation. When you contemplate on one particular idea, that leads you to samadhi. Dharana, dhyana, samadhi. And samadhi was considered to be the highest state that a person could reach. So this was Patanjali's sutras. Patanjali took the theory of Kapila, the Sankhya theory, but he added the 25th category, Ishvara. So he made it theistic. Now Gautama came along. Gautama was a logician, and he devised a system of logic and arguments, and debating. So somebody who learns Nyaya of Gautama, nobody can defeat him in an argument or a debate, because he will know all the different ways of winning an argument and tackling an opponent, all the various tactics of debating, rhetoric. That's all in the Nyaya philosophy. And then Kanada came along. Kanada is the Indian Democritus. You know, in the Greek philosophy there is a person called Democritus. He came up with this idea of the atom. In ancient Greece, he imagined what will happen if I start breaking down something to its minutest constituents. I break it in half and then quarter and 1/8 and 1/16, etc. How far can I go? He said that I will come finally to one particle which I cannot split any further, and he called it the atom. And they formed the atomic theory, Democritus and Leucippus, in ancient Greece. And it was revived in our modern age, but quantum physics came in. And they discovered that you can go beyond the atom also. But in ancient times, we had Kanada. Kanada said that this whole universe, everything is made up of atoms, and he called them Anu. Anu is like a mathematical point. It has no dimensions. It's just got a location. And when three Anus come together, it gets 3 dimensions, and that becomes the basis for the physical universe. That is called the Vaisheshika theory. They have a very beautiful system to explain all the various experiences we have. And then Jaimini came along. Jaimini designed the Purva Mimamsa philosophy, in which he examined the Vedas and he found out how mantras are effective. When you invoke a mantra, how that mantra can respond, what is the effect of mantras, and how each mantra should be spoken correctly. So this whole language, semiosis, that is the Purva Mimamsa. And then we come to Uttara Mimamsa, which is Vedanta. So this 6 darshanas, they are called Shad darshanas, classic darshanas. Gita is taking Sankhya Yoga here again, but this Sankhya here is not exactly like Kapila Muni Sankhya. It is slightly modified. But the idea is that he is taking the rationalist way of thinking, using your reason. And by using your reason, you are coming to the notion of the Absolute, the notion of the Self. This is a unique way of teaching in which the final teaching is given to you right in the beginning itself. In the beginning, Arjuna is given the final teaching, that you are the Self. Being cannot cease to be. This is the logical way of presenting. That which is eternal cannot cease to be. And that which has no being, it cannot exist. And you are lamenting for something which doesn't exist. It is because your manner of thinking is that you identify yourself with the body. You are identifying yourself with something which is perishing. You are identifying yourself with something which is constantly changing. And that identification is the root cause of your lamentation and your fear. And you think you are the killer, and you think you are going to be killed. The sense of agency that has come into you is all because of your ignorance. So this rational way of thinking, this rational way of reasoning it out with him, that is the Sankhya that is spoken of here. The first teaching that is given to him is correct your reasoning. In your reasoning power itself, there is error. And because of that error in reason, error in the buddhi, there is wrong conclusions. So the wrong conclusion has to be corrected by the right notion. What is the right notion? The right notion is that na hanyate hanyamane sharire, that we have something called the soul in us. We have something called Atma in us. And that Atman in us cannot perish. It was never born. It will never die. There was never a time when it came into existence. There is never a time when it will cease to be. So this is the right notion. And to think that you are the self, this is only a mantle that we have taken on. It is a garment, a dress. Easier said, it's not so easy to practice. But this is where meditation is necessary. That this notion which we have has to be repeatedly pondered over by each person. That is the mananam that comes in. First we have a shravanam, then the mananam, and then the nididhyasana. When we read something like this from the Gita, it is a Sravanam. We are hearing it or reading it for the first time. Then we ponder over it. As we ponder over it, its truth begins to manifest. This is the way of teaching through Shruti. In Vedanta, there are 4 ways by which knowledge is acquired by a person. There is a way called Pratyaksha, then there is a way called Anumana, and then there is called Upamana, and then there is called Shabda Pramana. Pratyaksha means seeing something before you, directly experiencing it, perception. Anumana means inference. If you see smoke, you can infer that there is a fire there. And then there is Upamana. Upamana means comparison. You have not seen something before, but you hear a description about it, and when you see it, you compare your description with what you see before, and you recognize it, and you say, yes, this is it, Anumana. So Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana, these 3 methods work in the transactional world only. They cannot help us in the world of the self or the higher knowledge. There only the Shruti works, the word wisdom, the word of scriptures. So when we receive a word of scripture, we accept it first of all, and then we ponder over it. When we ponder over the word of scripture, its truth begins to be realized. So we say this is a priori way of teaching. There are 2 ways, a priori and a posteriori. Science is a posteriori. You do an experiment, you prove the experiment, and then you come to the conclusion. Or you learn through experience, that is a posteriori. In this case, it is a priori. Before you have experienced it, you are given the teachings. You accept it because it is coming from a reliable source. And then you ponder over it. And when you ponder over it, its truth manifests. The teachings here are coming as a priori notions of the self, or a priori notion of the absolute, coming from the mouth of Sri Krishna. So we accept it, and we ponder over it. And as we ponder over it, its reality begins to manifest. The first confusion of Arjuna here is of killing and being the agent, the karta, the bhokta, and the jnata. I am the agent. I believe I have done this. The moment I believe I have done this, I feel responsible, I feel obliged. So who is the real agent? This is the question. Are you the real agent, or have you the agency? So this is where later on we will come to understand how nature is functioning. Nature has a dynamic in it, and nature functions according to its dynamics. And it is that nature which is functioning, and we assign agency to that nature. To something which is natural, we assign our agency and say that I have done it. Actually, it is done by the forces of nature, by the qualities of nature. And the self that we speak about, the immortal self, is existing only as a witness. In Aristotle's thinking, he called it the unmoved mover. It makes things move, but itself it is not moved. It does not change, but in its presence, like a catalyst in chemistry, it causes other things to change. So that distinction is important. If we have the intelligence and the ability, we should be able to distinguish this subtle difference between the agent and the witness, the sakshi and the karta. The sakshi is the self, and that is a constant in us. Nature is the variable in us. It is always constantly changing. We are going through alternating states of consciousness. We don't have the same mood from morning till evening. We have already changed so many times. So that changing, altering states of consciousness, even from dream and deep sleep to wakeful, and in the course of the day having clarity, restlessness or lethargy, all these varying states that come to us belong to nature and are the mirror in which the spirit is being reflected. The mind is like only a mirror in which we are experiencing, on which the universe is reflected. And the quality of that mirror, quality of that mind depends on the nature of the guna that is present. When sattva is present, the mirror is absolutely clear and clean. When rajas is present, the mirror is like a flawed mirror, exaggerations come in. And when tamas is present, the mirror becomes cloudy. You cannot see anything. So that is the functioning of our instrument, the instrumentality of the mind and the body and the intellect. But where is the mind and the body and the intellect getting its energy to function, getting its knowledge to function, getting its light to function? So that is self. And that self never undergoes any change. That self is a constant. And that self has no sense of suffering. It is pure ananda. So we say Satchidananda. Satchidananda. The more we move towards the self, we begin to experience the constant state of happiness, the constant state of well-being, the unchanging state of ananda. And that is the self. These are, of course, the teachings towards the center. Before that, we have to resolve this thing called karma. That is the actions that we have to perform. We are obliged to perform. And also we are naturally inclined to perform. How do we understand the karma? We are a product of our own karma. We are experiencing our own karma. Nobody can escape his karma. So this karma yoga, or the way to discipline one's karma, so that karma itself becomes our friend and becomes a convenient method. Instead of being an obstacle, it becomes a method conducive to our spiritual advancement. That is treating karma as a yoga. So that is in the next chapter, the third chapter. Here the Sankhya Yoga, rational part of the second chapter is the distinction between the self and the non-self, the distinction between the spirit and the material aspect of a person. It's between the eternal and the perishing aspect of a person. That has to be, at least in theory to begin with, to be understood. And that is the first teaching that Arjuna gets. And like all skeptics, he does not readily accept it. He sees the difficulty and the contradictions of how can the self, which is transcendental, which is unblemished, of pure nature, interact with its exact opposite, which is matter. Matter has no light in it, no conscience in it. And self or soul is light through and through, knowledge through and through. So how does that self intermingle with matter? These are some of the most difficult questions and difficult problems in understanding how these two opposites are intermingling. But it is through this interaction of these two opposites that our world experience comes before us. And the difference between wisdom and ignorance is how a person orients himself. For theology, we construct the idea of God, and by keeping God as the supreme, we are always moving away from the natural. We move towards the divine. So I decided to take a sociological and psychological and historical perspective, not treating it as irrelevant, at the same time not trying to exaggerate any aspect of the first chapter, but trying to treat it exactly as a narrative, part of the Mahabharata, part of the myth, and giving us hints of the history and the culture. And I think in that it has thrown some light. What is known as the morality of the ancients and how the revaluations take place. This is an important word here, evaluation. That is how a culture of the past has to be modernized, as it were, and all its unnecessary parts have to be removed and a new thinking has to be brought in. I think that is what is being done really in the first chapter, where through the characters and how the presentation is done, you can see that a lot of older values are being pushed aside and are being at least downgraded as saying they are not so important, and instead a new value is being presented which is superior and more beneficial for mankind. So this is what Vyasa could do. We must remember that behind this is the mind of Vyasa, as the author of the Gita, and he uses all these various literary devices and characters to carry this message through and to open up the unconscious of a mind. Jung has a good theory. He speaks of the collective unconscious. We have our surface mind, and then we have an unconscious mind, and then in the unconscious mind we also have the racial consciousness, And in the racial consciousness, everybody has buried within them all the historical memories of the past. It's called the collective consciousness of humanity, which is full of archetypes, model set ways of thinking as archetypes. It is in that area that the correction is taking place, in the collective unconscious and in the racial memories, so that human beings can evolve to a better way of thinking, a more universal way of thinking, and liberated way. There's always a liberation here. We're talking of moksha. Gita is a moksha shastra, and how a person can get liberated from closed morality to an open morality, dynamic religion, and a more dynamic way of living. So it's really a dynamism here, that the closed and orthodox ways are being opened up, and a more dynamic and a more spiritual way of life is being presented, so that a human being can live as a more fulfilled person, more in touch with the divine, and at the same time more in touch with humanity also. So there's a barrier. The race becomes a boundary. When you say a tribe becomes a boundary. When you say a clan becomes a boundary. So here the boundary is being expanded or dissolved, so that person can see beyond. You can see the total picture, how all of humanity comes under the same one loving God or one supreme God. There is only one God. There is only one goal, and there is only one people. This is what the greatest of thinkers have always said. And it is to that oneness that we are being taken. From the narrow and small and exclusive way of thinking, we are being taken to this supreme and all-encompassing and total way of thinking, in which nothing is excluded. When we have a narrow way, we include and we also exclude. But when we have a total vision, there is nothing to exclude. Everything is included in it. Everything has its proper placement. So there's no conflict in a person. There's nothing a person is against or anything that is bothering a person, because everything has its proper place. And we begin to understand where everything fits into the total scheme. The total scheme of creation has a place for everybody. Man makes certain rules and then decides this is not right or that is not right. But does creation have such rules? That we don't know. Obviously everybody has their own place. So it is the understanding which has to become evolved, which must grow. And it is that growth which is being taught through Arjuna as an able and fit person. He is taken as the most ideal person because he is a very efficient warrior himself. He is an intelligent person. And he also has the sensitive feelings. So anybody who wants to be a spiritual person must have some spiritual qualities. And the spiritual qualities, that sensitivity and able to see the real inner life of human beings. Sankhyan theory and this Vaisheshika theory and even Vedanta, they are all coming together with physics. The new particle physics, if you read, it's just amazing how close physicists are coming to these ways of thinking. Some dualism is there in Sankhyan theory. It's a dualistic theory. Gunas belong to matter. The spirit, Purusha, stands apart as the luminous principle. Some sort of internal event takes place and then they start separating. And they become Purusha and Prakriti. Gunas come much later. This is at a very, very early stage. Avyakta, Mahat Tattva, Ahankara. It is a brilliant discovery. The 5 elements are linked with the 5 sense organs and the 5 perceptions. You can reduce the whole of creation to 5 elements. That is earth, water, fire, air and ether. All our chemicals, everything is a product of earth. Viscosity, liquid, is the second quality that we have here. Air, gaseousness, is another quality that we have. Thermal quality, fire, whether it's in the sun or whether it is in our own bodies as our heat or in the cooking fire. It's all the same principle of thermal energy. And then Akasha or space. That is, science cannot prove that it exists because it's such a fine thing that no instrument can detect it. But that is what makes it possible for us to speak, that vibrates. And therefore that has the quality of sound. It's like a framework. It's excellent, very brilliant. And 5 sense organs. Earth has the quality of smell, so nose and smell and earth. Water gives us taste. Only that substance which dissolves in water can be tasted. Then fire gives a form. Fire gives light. Through light we can see. And then air, the only way to detect air is through touch. You can't make out whether there is air or not any other way. But move your hand, you can feel the air, touch. And then sound, it is hearing. Then the mind. When you come to mind, then the gunas start operating. How do our thoughts operate? When there is a sattva guna, we have clarity of mind. We are able to see things exactly as it is clear. When there is rajoguna, then we have a disturbance. We are agitated. When we come under the influence of tamoguna, then lethargy comes in. A person cannot see clearly. When you come to Vedanta, the theories change. Vedanta accepts 3 gunas and the mind, etc. But the spirit aspect becomes the real essence of everybody, is that one self. And Maya comes into the picture now. The world as we experience it is called Maya. That which is not there really, but you think it is there. The idea in our mind is creating the world that we see outside. We don't see things as they are. We experience a thing, an object. When you said subject and object, or knower and the knower has only an idea of what the known is. And I see you and you seeing me. What are we actually seeing? We are seeing only a generation, a creation of our own mind. It's very difficult to grasp, but it's so profoundly true because we know that light is just a vibration. Different colors of light is nothing but different vibrations according to the spectrum. And so what is coming up to the eye is only a vibration of energy. And from there it gets converted into electrical energy. From nerve it becomes electrical energy. And then it goes to visual area of the brain, which is at the back here. And then it is chemical there. Chemistry takes place. So from all these functions, how do we generate a person there? It is only an idea in our mind. So there's really no outside. What is outside is actually also inside. What is seen outside as an object, when I look at this, it's a book. But in my mind, I have an idea that there is something called a book. And because I have that idea of a book, I can see this thing as a book. I have an idea of a person, then I see that person. I have an idea of the sky, so I can see this. So what exists outside as things is in our brain as ideas. If we don't have the idea, we will never understand what the thing outside is. To understand anything in the world, we must have a corresponding understanding inside us. We must figure it out inside us. Only then it makes sense, otherwise it won't make sense. So in Vedanta they give a lot of importance to perception first. First they try to understand how do you perceive this world. How do we recognize? That itself becomes quite an interesting subject. Classically they say it's a triputi, that is one consciousness splits into 3. The knower, known and knowledge. And there is a knower which says, I am. And there is a known which says, this is. And then there is the knowledge about that knower and the known. That splitting of triputi gives us this experience of the world. And what the person is trying to do is to discover that unitive consciousness, the consciousness before it split up. If you do that, then you're not affected by the phenomenal world. How do you arrive at consciousness before it has undergone this split? We experience it only after it has split into the knower, known and knowledge. In the 18th chapter, he says, Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam. He says, abandoning all dharmas, come to me alone. That is really the truth. Ultimately, you go beyond dharma also. So dharma is to align yourself to the supreme truth. You can't do it without dharma. You see, there is the supreme truth. We are aligning ourselves to it through our dharma. And by the grace of God coming from the opposite side, the more our dharma gets purified, we begin to see more of this unitive self. Ultimately, you find that you are uniting with the Lord, which is nothing other than the self, which is nothing other than the pure consciousness. Different schools of thought. In Vedanta, you don't want to be theistic, so you don't say God, but you say self. In a theistic concept, you say God, because it is easier to relate with when you say God. But if you say self, now where is this self? If you say it is within you, you get confused with the ego. There is an ego sitting there also, all the time. So how to cancel out the ego, that's a very difficult task. That is why you need good gurus. When you go to gurus, they'll knock your ego out first thing. That is where this despondency comes in. When Arjuna is coming to that level of despondency, his ego is completely shattered. He is no longer a Kshatriya, he cannot fight, he cannot function. He has no more self left, in a sense. It is then that the teaching begins. Most wisdom teaching, the biggest obstacle is the ego. And the problem is nothing wrong with the ego, but it sort of usurps. It's not the important person, but it begins to take the importance as the agent. It says, I did it, I am, and it gets conditioned with the mind through pleasure conditioning. And then that creates a very big obstacle. So all the bhakti margas, when they are bowing down all the time, that is to keep the ego in check. It's like the moon which shines. It has no light of its own, shining because of the sunlight. Ego is like that. Ego has no real existence of its own. It exists because of the soul. But it starts taking all the importance. And it perishes with the body. But the soul doesn't perish. So why is a person not able to see the soul? It is because he is always clouded by the ego. Life is like that, society is like that the ego is always kept alive. One person has to be a really truth-loving person to keep the ego in check. If a person loves truth and is always truthful, there is no problem. But when a person starts deviating from truth, then the ego becomes very difficult to manage.